Good afternoon. Welcome to the Venable webinar on the new age of infrastructure. Today's webinar is the first in a series, and we'll be analyzing how the Biden administration and Congress may ultimately address the current state of federal investment towards infrastructure in the United States. I'm Catherine Floyd. I'm a partner in the infrastructure practice at Venable, and I'm going to be serving as the moderator of today's webinar. I am joined by my colleagues from Venable, Jim Burnley, Yardley Polis Kimball, Jim Riley, and Fred Wagner. So before we get into the meat of the webinar, I wanted to cover a few administrative matters. The code for obtaining the CLE credit, for those of you who would like that, will be given during the presentation. And also I encourage folks to reach out and submit questions to the panelists using the question and answer function within the webinar platform. I do note that depending on how long we go today, we may not be able to answer all of your questions during the live presentation, but we will be happy to follow up with answers once the webinar has concluded. So before we go to our distinguished panelists, I wanted to take a moment to set the stage for our discussion. To begin with, I wanted to ask the question of how did we get here? And the short answer is, I think as many of you know, is that Congress simply hasn't been able for quite a long time to get an infrastructure bill across the finish line. So why is it particularly difficult on the topic of infrastructure? And I would answer that by saying it can probably best be explained by the fact that it is such a really heavy lift, and it still is today. It's a heavy lift for the federal government to step in and fill in areas where states and local governments and private actors cannot do it by themselves. So during today's webinar, we're going to explore what we can expect now and why this time it's going to be different. No doubt, there are changed times. We've got the pandemic and the new Biden administration. And indeed, over the past 2 days, we've been hearing from President Biden about his rollout of his vision for a $2.3 trillion transformational plan for infrastructure. So let's get going. I'd like to turn to our first panelist and introduce her, Yardley Polis. Yardley most recently served as Chief of Staff and Chief Counsel to Congressman Bobby Rush, Chairman of the Energy Subcommittee. And prior to that, Yardley was the head of congressional affairs at Motorola. So Yardley, I'm going to pitch the first question to you, being fresh off the Hill. I'd like you to tell us what your thoughts are on the Biden's newest proposal for infrastructure, which of course has just been unveiled, and what you anticipate being the likely scope of infrastructure legislation this year.
Well, thank you, Catherine. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today with everyone. I guess before I begin to speak about the scope of the package, it's important that I really spend some time to talk about what I believe is the administration's overarching themes. It's important that I point what the themes are and the goals are because they're really linked to the scope of the package. I'm not sure if you have the slide. I would like to, if you can go to the
Pardon me,
sure.
Please go ahead. I'm going to try to get the slide to move.
Sure. Well, we have identified like 4 overarching themes that we see. Obviously, the first one is the administration has to address the aging infrastructure. As we know, the American Society of Civil Engineers has given us a C- for our infrastructure. And believe it or not, that's actually an improvement from a D- that we received 2 years ago. So it's important that we address the aging infrastructure and also modernize the infrastructure. The second theme I would say and goal is to stimulate and revive the economy harmed by COVID. It's important, and as we saw in the plan yesterday from the Biden administration, we want to move from shovel-worthy projects to shovel-ready projects. And then the third theme goal I would say is obviously to decouple, and we're seeing it over and over repeated by the administration, they want to decarbonize the economy, especially the transportation economy, away from fossil fuels. So we're hearing clean energy, clean energy. And the Biden administration has repeatedly mentioned how the transportation sector is the biggest contributor of greenhouse gases. And lastly, I would say the theme that we're hearing again and again is equity, justice, and inclusion. And I guess what that means is that they want to address pollution, infrastructure disinvestment in poor and urban areas. And also we're hearing them speak to about leveling the playing field for DBEs, which is disadvantaged business enterprises, so they can have access to some of these infrastructure projects. If we can do the next slide. Now, to speak about the scope of the project, the infrastructure package, obviously it's ambitious, very broad, and it's divided in two parts that we have seen. We see the capital, the physical capital intensive projects, and also the human capital, social, I would say, infrastructure projects. I'm going to highlight a couple examples of each one. I know my colleagues are going to give you a deeper dive on these, but I just want to kind of bring to your attention some of the recurring themes and physical capital intensive infrastructure projects that we are seeing. We are definitely seeing an investment in our nation's grid infrastructure. Specifically, we're going to see funding for grid modernization and resiliency. And what I mean by resiliency has to be resilient to climate change and also to cybersecurity. And as we can see from the power outages that recently happened in Texas, it's demonstrated the need for us the nation to fortify our grid against these extreme weather and climate change. Also, I want to highlight broadband infrastructure, what I call the digital infrastructure. A significant amount of money, I think $100 billion was proposed, and that would deal exactly with building out high-speed infrastructure in unserved and underserved areas to basically connect and ensure universal connectivity throughout the US. We're also seeing provisions and talk about supporting what we call the EBB program, and that's called Emergency Broadband Benefit, to make sure that also broadband is affordable for those who cannot access it. And then we're also, in terms of physical, we're seeing, of course, healthcare modernization. And we saw with COVID-19 how fragile the state of our healthcare infrastructure was. So we're seeing funding dollars going to address and modernize these and upgrade and repair our hospitals, especially the VA hospitals. I believe the administration pointed out that they're going to spend at least $18 billion to modernize our outdated hospitals, the VA facilities, which I believe is an average of 58 years old, most of their facilities. Next slide, please. And now if I can speak a little bit to what I'm calling, and many of us are calling human capital or social infrastructure. You're going to see provisions going to expand home and community services for those who are disabled and who want to stay home. You're seeing dollars flowing for home healthcare workers. Many of these essential workers had bear the brunt of the COVID-19 in terms of the workforce. And then also we're seeing funding dollars, $48 billion, I believe the administration has talked about. And that's to tackle our workforce training issues, to address like the shortages of workers in the skilled trades, such as utility linemen, plumbers, pilots, railroad workers, and truck drivers. So again, it's a lot, it's broad, but I believe it's a good start, and I know we're going to focus a lot about these, but I want to end here for the interest of time, Catherine.
Thank you, Yardley, appreciate it. Let's turn now to Jim Riley. I'm going to go to the next slide. Let me introduce Jim. Jim previously worked in the US Senate with Senator Tom Carper, first as his energy and environmental advisor, and later as his chief of staff. In that capacity, he worked closely with Senator Carper, as well as the other senator from Delaware, Joe Biden, and his staff. More recently, Jim directed the federal legislative policy efforts of the American Wind Energy Association. and Jim recently joined Venable. I'm going to try the slide again here. There we go.
Great.
So
Great.
Jim, yeah, thank you. If you could take us through your thoughts, please, on the process you foresee for producing infrastructure legislation, and also comment on your expectations regarding timing.
I'd be happy to do that. Thanks, Catherine, for the invitation here today. So as you said, I'll try to lay out a sense of both the timing and the process that we expect as this infrastructure package, or whatever you want to call it, moves through Washington this year. As has been said, this is a very ambitious proposal laid out by the president, and turning it into legislation and into law is going to be difficult. There's no doubt about that. In fact, there's no guarantee that it even reaches the finish line this year or this Congress, or what shape it will be in if it does get there. But we do know that there's going to be some hectic days during this process, and probably a number of surprises and detours along the way. So I think to those that are on the webinar, you might be the smartest people by choosing to start paying attention now. And you're going to want to stay in touch with people here at Venable as things go forward over the next weeks and months. So how might this play out? In theory, Congress does this all the time. You know, Schoolhouse Rock, it's just a bill, House and Senate work it out and send it to the president. Well, I think in reality, and particularly here with this infrastructure initiative, we're not going to see a traditional process. The paradigms are shifting, and the process to achieve an outcome will be impacted in ways that are not yet very clear to some people. But what is clear is this, is like in the past, Congress will consider elements of infrastructure, and if they're successful, that bill will go to the president for his signature. We also know, though, that in addition to the traditional process, there'll be some non-traditional activity. And what I mean by that is there's going to be unexpected partnerships, creating opportunities and challenges along the way that we will stay close to as the debate moves forward, and we hope to be able to answer your questions during the process. So for me, I'm going to track three primary players as things go forward. Committees in Congress with jurisdiction over elements of the package. Second, the leadership of the House and Senate, who are going to attempt to steer whatever package or packages are developed. And lastly, the White House. In the House and in the Senate, committees are already underway, moving to reauthorize the Surface Transportation Act. This is something Congress has done before. And so in creating legislation like this, understand that Congress will default to familiar habits and address problems with the tools that it's used in the past. But here, two issues arise. First, and as Catherine mentioned, of late, the traditional processes, be it for infrastructure or some other pieces of legislation, haven't been successful. They haven't gotten things to the finish line. But second, the menu of issues and the price tag here is much larger and more ambitious than in the past. So this effort promises to be much more than a normal Surface Transportation Act reauthorization. And given the expanded scope, we certainly expect we'll see some important differences in the process that deserve attention. So in the House, the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee holds the pen on most of the traditional concrete pipes and steel infrastructure type things that we see in a traditional infrastructure package. And that committee is already holding hearings, and Chairman DeFazio hopes to mark up something later this spring. Also in the House, the Energy and Commerce Committee is looking at how the roads and the rails are actually used per their jurisdiction, as well as mapping out the energy and broadband and other provisions that would fall in their jurisdiction. Finally, in the House, the Ways and Means Committee will attempt to figure out what may be the most challenging political puzzle, and I think Secretary Burnley will talk a little bit about this more, of how do you pay for an infrastructure package? Catherine, we can go to the next slide. So in the Senate, the Environment and Public Works Committee traditionally leads the effort on an infrastructure bill. And Senator Carper, who was mentioned, I staffed on this committee and who now chairs the committee, has set a target of Memorial Day to mark up their elements. Also in the Senate, the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee will be looking at policy issues in its jurisdiction. For example, vehicle safety and performance, which are getting even more attention as electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles become more common. In the Senate, there's a unique jurisdictional issue where the Banking Committee holds a responsibility for public transit, so they'll be involved here. And lastly, the Senate Finance Committee will do its attempt at figuring out the solutions on the pay-fors. Not on this list, but probably should be, is the Senate's Energy and Natural Resources Committee, which, given the list of issues laid out, will probably be looking at electricity and land use issues as things go forward as well. So those committees, before we go to this slide, let me just say that those committees are where I would call the traditional venues where most work on infrastructure bills has been done in the past. But as mentioned, this paradigm is shifting. And from the conversations we're having on the Hill, we see other committees planning to already engage on this. For example, labor and workforce issues will draw committees with education and labor jurisdiction. And yesterday, we heard mention of healthcare and veterans care and housing, affordable housing. So all of those mentioned by the president will bring other committees into play. Notably, another paradigm shift that we're seeing here is the number of cross-jurisdictional themes, I'll call them, many of which don't fit neatly into one committee or even two. So, for example, making infrastructure resilient to weather events, or addressing racial justice and equity issues across the economy are things that don't fit neatly into one committee. And I think what that means is we'll see ideas and input coming from multiple corners of Congress, and we're probably going to see some new partnerships created as things evolve. So my point here is be prepared to engage via the traditional venues, but also expect and be prepared for the unexpected, I guess is the simplest way to state it. Now is the time that organizations should be thinking of their strategy to be successful. So on this last slide, speaking of timing, let's just talk a little bit about how this might play out. I think yesterday is kind of like the opening pistol of a decathlon. There's still a lot of events and a long way to go. Still to come from the White House will be their 2022 budget proposal, which we should see shortly. And that will probably provide even more detail to their vision. I mentioned that committees are already underway with hearings. In some cases, the Senate Environment Committee, for example, has already marked up a drinking water and wastewater bill. And other bills, other committees are doing the same. And so many pieces are starting to move forward, but we're going to see them now start to translate what the president laid out yesterday and see if it's something that can pass muster. I think that I said I'd mention congressional leadership, and let me just say that while committees still hold the significant sway in writing major legislation, in recent years, we've seen more and more influence coming from House and Senate leadership offices. In addition to controlling the calendar and when legislation moves to the floor for consideration, more and more they also are involved in the what, which policy ideas are or are not included. And I think in this case, especially given the broad scope of the package, or what is envisioned to be this package, I think that the Senate and House leadership offices are going to have a major impact. You may have also heard talk of budget reconciliation, and a full explanation of budget reconciliation is really beyond the scope of what we have here today. But I think the Cliff Notes version, I would just sum up as if 60 or more senators, let's just focus on the Senate here, can agree to something, budget reconciliation really isn't going to come into force or won't be necessary to move something. But since we have a 50-50 Senate at the moment, getting to 60 is going to be that challenge that could bring reconciliation into play. And the majority party might use that if they decide that that's how they need to advance legislation. However, the thing about reconciliation is that it restricts what can be in a bill. So if that's the route that is followed, it will probably be a more limited package than what would have been able to happen via regular order. So again, stay tuned there. And that's something we're watching closely. I think both parties in the House and Senate will be doing the math to see what's achievable. Some ideas are going to be dropped along the way, others added. Again, leadership's role will be critical in that part of it. I think in the Senate, we'll be watching how Senators Schumer and Senator McConnell work together, as well as work with their caucuses. And same in the House, where Speaker Pelosi and Leader McCarthy will be working with their teams as we go towards a conference and ultimately final passage. So to wrap up my section here, I just want to say that, again, as I think of this, the infrastructure approach here is like a multi-course holiday meal. And as we mentioned, the reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Act, which is already underway, might be, you can think of it as the traditional main course, a turkey on Thanksgiving table. But what we saw from President Biden yesterday signals that there's going to be several new items being cooked in the kitchen. If and how, to be honest, they make it to the table is still an open question, and one that we're engaging with offices on the Hill and in the administration to follow. I think as this goes forward, I encourage you to come back to us with questions. We'll have information and hopefully some answers for you as this goes forward. This is going to be a pretty exciting year in the infrastructure space in Washington. So thanks for joining us. And Catherine, with that, I'll take it back to you.
Thanks, Jim, for all of your insights. Now we want to pivot here to talk a little bit more in detail about the policy priorities for the infrastructure plan. And our panelist for this topic is Fred Wagner. Fred previously served as FHWA Chief Counsel in the Obama-Biden administration and has many years in private practice helping clients with infrastructure projects. He currently chairs the Transportation Research Board's legal section. So Fred, let me hand this over to you, and perhaps you can share your views on how the Biden administration's plans and priorities will come forward.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. I'll also thank Jim Riley for making me really hungry. His talk about main courses and smorgasbords and whatnot got me hungry, not just for infrastructure. So thanks a lot, Jim, and welcome to the firm. I think it's fair to say that the proposal currently before the American people that the president presented yesterday, and that's being fleshed out, is truly transformational. And the way to consider that is through the lens of the major policy initiatives that Yardley mentioned before that I'm going to talk about in more detail. The best way to think about it is the way the world was and the way the world would be under this proposal if it were to be enacted, at least in some substantial form. The biggest thing to consider is the role of the federal government. In the traditional sense, especially in the transportation infrastructure world, the federal government has relatively little to say over what projects get selected and why. Those are largely the domain of the state departments of transportation. They're the domain of federal grantees that have their own priorities and initiatives as a result of planning processes in those jurisdictions in those states. In a traditional year under the Highway Trust Fund world, you'd get, most of the money coming from the federal government, matched by the states, but largely selected by the grantees themselves. If this proposal moves forward, in addition to the baseline formula funding there would be a tremendous influx of additional dollars designed specifically to advance initiatives selected by the federal government as important, as decided to be important by the Biden administration. And the four on your screen are clearly the ones that everybody has heard about. And so this fundamental shift from the locals deciding to the federal government having a much greater role in deciding is going to be seen in two ways. One, it would be seen in these new pots of money, specifically designated to advance certain issues. And if advanced in legislation, I would anticipate that there would be specific standards and terms that individual states or grantees would need to reach in order to get the money. The second way it's going to change is that I think you're going to see a much greater emphasis on discretionary funding, even in the traditional highway trust fund allocation of dollars, as opposed to formula funding. When I was there in any given year, it was between 9 and maybe 11% of the total budget. And as I left the administration, Congress severely restricted the amount of discretionary dollars. Under this proposal, and I think the things that the Biden administration wants to do, you will see that increase. So many more discretionary dollars and a much, much bigger pot of money specifically designated to advance certain issues. And that truly is transformational from the generally laissez-faire attitude of the federal government to say, hey, you guys grantees, you states, you decide what you want to do, and we'll be there to help you. Now it's, we'd really like you to do these things. And if you do, we'll be there to help you. And that is truly a transformational change. But besides figuring out what kind of projects get built and where they get built, each of these specific areas represents a tremendous change, a mindset on how things would work. So let's take climate, for example. The concerns about climate and the way climate and GHG emissions are handled in the ordinary sense, that happens right now. It happens in many different ways. It happens under NEPA, when the federal government and its local partners look at the impacts of a proposed action. They are looking at air impacts analyses. They are looking at GHG analyses. But what this proposal means is that the type of projects that would be advanced not only would evaluate and understand how those projects would affect GHG and climate concerns, but they will advance those concerns in a way consistent with the policies articulated by the administration. So you will see a much greater emphasis on transit, on alternative transportation, on the electrification of the transportation sector, on getting electrified buses and trucks out into the marketplace, all the things that advance climate initiatives, not just track them. And I think that's been the criticism over many, many years from the left. They said, you know, you've been just telling us what's going to happen from a climate perspective, but you've not been really doing anything about it. And now this proposal says we will be funding specific programs to advance this. So as an example, the Federal Transit Administration has a low-no program, low or no emissions vehicles, where they get grants out to the marketplace to buy electric buses. But that's a drop in the bucket compared to what's proposed under this proposal, where not only the buses will go out, but they're trying to advance the electrification of school buses, electrifications of trucks. And it's a really different way of approaching climate from an infrastructure perspective. In addition to the resiliency topics that Yardley talked about, picking projects that will help prevent difficulties from climate, such as flooding that we've seen around the country, such as maybe advancing asphalt type structures and research into asphalt, because we've seen extreme heat affecting airplane tarmacs. And so we need advancement in those areas as well. The other area that's going to see a transformational change is in equity. For too long, critics of all administrations, Democratic and Republican, have said that environmental justice has literally been a check the box exercise. It's been a situation where you just say, hey, is this project going through a disadvantaged community? If so, what should we do about it? And it was literally check the box. We did it. We looked at it, kind of we're done. And many folks have said, legitimately so, that these communities have certainly been accounted for, but they've not been listened to. Under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, entities had rights to bring claims against the agency when they felt that transportation projects were being done in a discriminatory fashion. I worked on one of those at the Federal Highway Administration, and it was the first time in literally 20 years that a claim was seen through from bringing the claim to resolving the claim and resolving it in favor of the group that brought the Title VI claim. First time in 20 years. So you can imagine the mindset with a new administration saying, we're making this not just an emphasis, but perhaps the emphasis in what we're doing. And what does that mean? That means giving communities of color, disadvantaged communities, a greater say in project development. And if you don't believe me, it's happened already. Just 2 weeks ago, the Texas Department of Transportation received a letter from the Federal Highway Administration saying that the FHWA was putting on pause a major project in Houston, Texas, I-45, a $7 billion project that had already received a record of decision. It had already received it. And the federal government said, no, we're going to wait because we have Title VI concerns. That project had over 1,000 proposed displacements of homes and residences. The local communities, disadvantaged communities, were complaining bitterly about it. And FHWA swooped in after a record of decision said, we're putting it on pause. So this is a total mind shift from just tracking the problem to making it a priority in terms of the types of projects that get built, i.e. more transit, more micro transit opportunities for poorer communities to get access to mobility, as well as the type of projects that get built. And this really could not be more different in any way. In terms of COVID relief, we've been here before. It was called ARA, the Recovery Act in 2009. And again, this administration learned lessons from that experience and is trying to move away from it. Never again are you going to hear the term shovel ready. Shovel ready is verboten in this administration because too often people felt that shovel ready meant that we were sacrificing the initiatives, the type of projects that we wanted to see built just to get dollars out the door. And so what happened, we did a whole bunch of repaving work on the highways, for example, and the types of projects really didn't move the needle. Now we want to be more selective, not just shovel ready, as Yardley said, but shovel worthy. Are these the types of projects that we want that are going to advance initiatives that people are interested in? And finally, in the labor front, it is not an overstatement to say that the labor movement will have more influence in this administration than perhaps any administration in the last 40 years. And we already received a question, an excellent question in the Q&A box about what specifically will the Jobs Act, it's called the Jobs Act, will mean for things like freight and supply chain infrastructure. Well, this plan has $80 billion specifically for rail and for passenger rail and for freight rail. This plan is specifically designed to advance kinds of projects that will be built here in America with American goods and American services. So it's tremendously focused on the labor market. You will see a greater emphasis on project labor agreements. You will see a greater emphasis on the types of projects where apprenticeships and job training can be incorporated into the federal dollars so that when the projects get built, it not only advances American jobs, but helps grow additional jobs by training members of the community, especially the local community. As an example, when I was at FHWA, it took forever just to get into a bill, a pilot program to allow the city of Los Angeles to emphasize and do local hiring for projects in and around LA. And that was hard just to get the pilot program. Not so now. The administration is going to ensure that job hiring, job training is an essential part of projects, that move forward. And obviously the last thing I'll say is the expanded notion of infrastructure. What infrastructure means and is also transformational. By including broadband, by including water treatment and water quality, by including transmission, by including health care, We're now considering the definition of healthcare where not just the Department of Transportation is going to be involved in infrastructure, but literally a half a dozen or more federal agencies are going to have a strong hand in moving forward the infrastructure vision. Obviously, the EPA, there's a new Environmental Equity Council the White House just announced this week. They will be big players. Housing and Urban Development, HHS, obviously the Department of the Interior. All these agencies are going to have a huge role in having a say in what projects get built and how they get built. Whereas before, the playing field was much more limited. So bottom line is that, as Jim Riley said, a long way to go before all these ideas actually get implemented. But the playing field that we're going to be debating is so different than ever before. And following it closely, as he said, is going to be imperative. And the type of things that are being debated are things that really heretofore have not been done in this matter. So, Catherine, that's the short answer. How big is it? Pretty darn big and pretty darn different. And it's going to be an exciting year. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. That was a very comprehensive overview with only one slide. So job well done. I want to just take a quick break before we turn to the last panelist. I promised you earlier that I would be giving out the CLE code. The CLE code is New Age 2021. Again, that's New Age 2021. So now we can turn to the last topic we plan to cover before we move to Q&A. And what we're going to talk about with Jim Burnley is what we can expect on how this massive infrastructure bill might be paid for. And specifically, when it comes to the Highway Trust Fund, which we've talked about earlier, we want to raise the question with Jim about whether it'll be funded through traditional revenue options, and also look at for other kinds of infrastructure in the Biden's broad plan, as we've outlined. Are we looking at tax hikes for corporations and for certain individuals? And, is that going to be different than what we've experienced in the past in terms of a revenue source? So let me advance the slide to Jim and let me introduce Jim. Jim Burnley, he is a former Secretary of Transportation, Deputy Secretary and General Counsel of DOT. Jim's practice includes a wide range of both transportation and infrastructure issues, both in the legislative arena and the regulatory arena. So Jim, let me give you the floor, and we're very interested to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Catherine. And I want to thank our participants for spending this hour with us. I'm going to start by caveating everything I'm about to say, and also by asking you please to ignore the slide until I've had a chance to talk about some other aspects of where we are on highway and transit programs. I'll come back to the slide, but for now, I don't want it to distract you. Everything I'm about to say is based on what we know at this moment, and given that the Biden administration's proposal is just a couple of days old, there, by definition, is more to be known about it, and the landscape is going to change in terms just of understanding more of the details of what they're proposing. But I am going to walk you through quickly some math based upon what we know as it applies to the highway and transit programs, both the traditional programs and the Biden administration proposals for highway and transit funding. And I would remind you, first off, that under current law, we're spending about $45 billion a year in federal aid on highways and a little over $12 billion a year in federal aid on transit. Overnight, both Politico and Bloomberg have been reporting that when the Biden administration releases his proposed budget next week, it will propose a straight line extension of current law as to the Highway Trust Fund. And if those reports are correct, what that would mean would be spending another $300 billion under the basic formula programs for highway and transit programs that we now have on our books. If you're just going to do a straight extension, that's what you'd do. You'd spend $300 billion on those programs over 5 years. But I want everybody to recall that last June, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee reported out a 5-year bill, and it did not total $300 billion, it totaled $500 billion. And that bill was then incorporated into a larger bill, which the full House passed in July of last year. Now, there's a timing difference in what the administration proposed yesterday that's very significant. And again, more to be learned about this. I can't caveat this enough, but I want you to understand where it looks like we are as of this afternoon. The expenditures that they are proposing are to be spread over 8 years, according to their documentation in the last 48 hours, with the taxes to offset those expenditures to be collected over 15 years. And most of us have already seen some press about the difference in the timing. So over 8 years, the administration is proposing a total of $115 billion over and above what's being spent through current programming for bridges and roads, plus an additional $85 billion for transit. Well, 115 plus 85 adds up to 200 billion spread over 8 years. So that would work out, in other words, to about an additional 14 billion a year for highways and bridges and 10.6 billion a year for transit. But remember that last year, the House passed a bill that provided 100 billion a year for roads and transit programs. So when you do the simple math, what the administration proposed yesterday, along with the reports from Bloomberg and Politico that they're just going to propose straight line funding of current programs funded out of the Highway Trust Fund for another 5 years, it comes down to $125 billion in new money for highway and transit programs, plus the $300 billion extension. That totals $425 billion over 5 years. But last year, the House passed a bill that provided $500 billion over 5 years. In other words, $75 billion more on a 5-year line. And again, how can this be? Well, don't lose sight of the fact that the proposal that the administration has released this week is an 8-year spend out, not a 5-year spend out. So if you do the math, the simple math of what that means per year, you come up with 75 billion in total, both in the existing programs plus the new proposals for highway and transit programs. In addition to that, you've got in the new proposal a very substantial shift, as Fred Wagner was talking about, a lot of changes in approach here. And as those of you who live in the highway and transit world know, the traditional ratio has been about 80% of expenditures on highways and about 20% on transit. Well, what the administration is proposing is much more parity as to the proposal this week. Whether they would try to also modify that ratio in their so-called straight line extension of the existing programs, we don't know, and we'll just have to wait and see what they do propose when that comes out in the next week or so. I should also note that the new Biden administration proposal has 80 billion for rail in it. It has 20 billion, as has been referenced, for what are called equity programs that haven't been defined in what's been released this week, but I'm sure will be in the days to come. And then there are other things that I did not include in my computations, like $25 billion for airports and money for maritime ports as well. So again, my focus is simply on pointing out that based on what we know today, that looks like what is being dedicated out of this overall very large package to highway and transit programs may actually be less than what the House passed last year. Now, let me come to this slide, and we'll have one other slide in a moment. This is data from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which is a bipartisan group of very esteemed Democrats and Republicans, including several OMB directors from both Democratic and Republican administrations. And they simply laid out what the alternatives are for the traditional highway trust fund programs and paying for them, because as those of you who follow these programs know, for the last 6-7 years, the taxes collected, primarily fuel taxes, but not exclusively fuel taxes, have fallen ever shorter of the amount of money that Congress wants to spend. And the difference has been made up by simply transferring money from general treasury accounts, also known as deficit financing. The Biden administration has signaled very clearly this week that it does not support either raising fuel taxes or beginning a transition to a vehicle miles traveled tax, which Secretary Buttigieg has actually been talking about until just the last few days as a possible alternative. But he has now personally signaled that the administration decision is not to propose a VMT or any fuel tax increase. So what that means in terms of going forward, even if we just do a straight line $300 billion 5-year extension of current programs, is that the administration will have to continue to make up that shortfall in the highway trust funded programs. And the gap is going to get bigger. It could be as much over the next 5 years as a total of $100 billion. And to the extent the administration is successful with its very aggressive proposals to move our society towards electric vehicles and away from petroleum fueled vehicles, obviously they don't pay fuel taxes. So the gap between even current levels of spending on highway and transit programs and the traditional revenue sources could get even bigger than that $100 billion over 5 years, depending on how fast that transition occurs. And if you would please, you can see here on this slide some of the alternatives that have been discussed that for now at least the administration has taken off the table, but I don't know that as this plays out that the Congress itself has taken them off the table. And then the Committee for Responsible Budget showed us what we'd have to do if you were going to try to match the revenue flow to current spending. And you get just, I'm not going to go through these in detail, but you get a sense of what some of the shortfalls can be. So there are an enormous number of very important questions that we don't have the answers to today. And we at Venable are going to obviously stay very focused on this and continue to do all we can to make sure that our clients and those who come to us for advice are kept up to date about these developments and what the implications of those developments are for those clients. And thanks again very much for the opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you, Jim. I'm just going to double check our timing. We've got about 10 minutes left. A lot of you have sent in great questions and we would like to answer them. I don't know if we can get through many of them with the time left, but let's try to do one or two if we can, and then we'll wrap up for today. And again, I encourage everyone to continue to put your questions through, and we will certainly try to connect with you after the webinar. So I'm going to go back to maybe a broad question, and I'm going to throw it out first to Jim Riley, if Jim can get back engaged here. There you are, Jim. Thank you. I wanted to sort of ask you, we've heard a tremendous amount of information from everyone, some very detailed, but I think taking a big step back and looking at the landscape ahead of us and people who have an interest in this, I would like to ask you the question of, is it too early, too late, or just the right time to engage now with Congress and the administration? And what is the best way to do that? Jim, you're on mute.
That's a good question and one I've been asked recently. Look, a couple things I'll say. The fact that the president in his proposal yesterday in Pittsburgh kind of pointed to several provisions that are already happening in Congress, versions from last year or things that are being refreshed, is a signal to people that the congressional process that has been effective sometimes in the past is in play here again. So it is not too late. In fact, I think it's the right time to be reaching out with with facts and with a compelling argument why a provision is important, either pro or con to your organization. And to do that, it's to go directly with with data about numbers of jobs, about the impact to infrastructure, and to share that with your local member of Congress or through a trade association. And those are things that Venable has years of experience working on, and we can certainly help deliver that message for you. And people, the other question you had built in there is it too late, or will it, I'll just translate it to, will there be a point where it's too late? And maybe, but this is going to take a while. As complex as this is, there's going to be opportunities throughout these months ahead for people to make their case. You may not be successful in having it heard, but yeah, I think that it is not too early, and now is the right time is the short answer.
That's helpful, Jim. Does anyone else want to add to that question and answer, or I can move on to a new one? All right. I have another one that I wanted to pose, again, kind of broad brush, and I don't know if Yardley, if you're still able to tap in here, but I wanted to kind of go back to, again, the fundamentals on what this piece of infrastructure is going to look like. Is it going to be a large comprehensive package, or is it going to be done in smaller segments, and what might they look like?
I think you'll see, in terms of the what I call, and we're saying physical intensive capital projects, it's going to be one large one. I think some of the other provisions dealing with social human infrastructure, such as I hope you can hear me. Can you? I'm testing this. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think like the other provisions dealing with human social project might be in smaller provisions, perhaps addressed in other packages, such like a healthcare package. But I definitely see infrastructure packages such as grid monetization, water infrastructure bills, all packaged together as one big bill.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm going to turn to another question that came in, and this is maybe in a different direction. It's not about what new legislation will look like, but maybe is more reflective on, and I'm going to ask you about this, Fred, what existing legal authority does the administration already have to advance its policy initiatives? I think you covered some of that, but let me ask you to make further comment if you'd like to.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. When we were in the Obama-Biden administration, the mantra was, what can we do without Congress? Because it became pretty apparent early on that there was going to be a lot of cooperation and collaboration from Congress. So that was, what can we do without Congress? Where's our existing authority to advance the things that we want to do? I think what we've heard to date is that the chief of staff, the president are all saying, look, we'd like to start from at least the possibility of some collaboration before we go that route. But that being said, so for example, you're going to see under the CEQ regulations under NEPA that are going to be rescinded by this administration. There's going to be a new notice of proposed rulemaking on the NEPA regulations about assessing environmental impacts of projects. You're going to see a much greater emphasis on how to look at greenhouse gas impacts and what does that mean for specific projects. They're going to do that under their existing authority. They don't have to change a thing in the regulations or under NEPA by statute to do that, but they could do that just as a matter of policy by instructions from CEQ to all the federal agencies to get involved in any of these infrastructure projects to do that. Similarly, the existing executive order that dates way back to the Clinton administration on environmental justice is going to receive additional heft. They don't have to do much else besides the new executive order, working on the foundation of the old executive orders to say this is what federal agencies must do. This is what they must analyze to take into account equity concerns. You're also going to see a tremendous impact on existing authority from the Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division getting involved in potential actions dealing not just with environmental justice writ large, but with pollution and environmental pollution issues. So all those things, Catherine, mean that there's a lot the administration can do right now and moving forward within the existing legal rubric.
Thanks, Fred. I think we have time for one quick question and answer. And Jim Burnley, I'd like to turn this one to you, please. Of course, we have a lot of project sponsors sitting out in our audience, and we're hearing about all this money being tossed around. What do you have to say about with the Biden administration proposals? Are they going to require non-federal contributions by project sponsors?
That's a very significant question to which we do not know the answer. Most of the programs on the books today as to highway and transit programs require a local or state match of 10 to 40, sometimes even 50%. But in what the administration has made public so far, there is no signal as to whether any local match at all will be required. And perhaps it would be required for some programs, but not others. But as to the programs administered by the Department of Transportation, requiring a local match traditionally has helped sort out the projects. In other words, the project sponsors, if they're going to spend their own money, tend to be a little more careful about what they send in the way of applications for federal grants. When you have a program, and we've had some programs like this in the past, like the Tiger program, it was called INFRA in the last administration, where you do not have a significant or any local match required or state match, then that puts a much greater burden on the federal DOT to set project criteria and to apply those criteria to sort out the projects that they ultimately decide are worthy of funding. So it will be interesting to see as this plays out whether the administration does propose any local or state match requirement. But at this point, we simply don't know.
Well, that sounds like another reason to stay tuned. That's an important issue. So I'd like to close the webinar for today. We want to thank everyone for joining, of course. If you are interested in listening to a recording of this session, it will be available on our website shortly. Please consider joining us for the next webinar on infrastructure, which is scheduled for April 22nd. We also invite you to look at the venable.com website to learn more and contact any of the excellent panelists that we had today to follow up on questions. And again, the questions you've submitted, we haven't gotten to. We will be reaching out to try to respond to those in due course. Appreciate again everyone joining and hope you found this interesting, and stay tuned. There's a lot more to come. Thank you.